The Atheist Debates Patreon Project presents Jordan Peterson versus 20 Atheists. Hey everybody, hope you're doing well. My name is Matt Dillahunty. If you're new here, I'm going to be responding to this video from Jordan Peterson versus 20 Atheists. Why? Well, several years ago, I sat on stage with Dr. Peterson and we had a lengthy discussion where I was just the lone atheist in a head-to-head, and I exposed many aspects of his flawed reasoning. My producer has queued up a supercut of Jordan's claims and some parts of the discussion that he had in that recent video. I have not watched it yet, so this is going to be me reacting to that content off the top of my head, which should be fun. And you'll get my thoughts as if I was somebody there who just happened to get tagged in. And then we'll also see some comments from some of the other people so I can talk about what did or didn't happen and give my thoughts on it. But before we start the main clip, there's a moment from my previous interaction with Jordan that I wanted to share. Now, after this entire conversation was over, he said that he would look forward to doing another follow-up conversation. And once the audience had started to leave, he walked off, went to his dressing room, and I never heard from him again. No discussion after the event, no nothing. And then he refused any future debates. So the original clip here goes a little bit like this. I was asking about how to confirm the supernatural, and Jordan mentioned mystical experiences. This brief clip is me trying to explain that anyone can claim that they've had a mystical or supernatural experience, but how can we confirm that the experience is of a mystical or supernatural quality or origin? And he will then interrupt me to talk about that it stops people from smoking. And well, here, just listen.
I fully agree that people take drugs and report experiences that they describe as mystical or supernatural. Just like people report other experiences as if they were religious or ghosts or whatever. We have no way of confirming that this something mystical or supernatural actually happened. What this is about the language.
Stops people from smoking.
Well, you can.
So in my objection that we don't have a way of confirming that it's mystical or supernatural in origin or quality, he immediately interrupts to say it stops people from smoking.
Stop smoking without any sort of supernatural intervention.
No, not really.
Now, it's funny because I had quit smoking several years before without any sort of mystical experience or anything else. And here's Dr. Peterson telling me that you can't really quit smoking without a mystical experience.
You can't stop smoking without supernatural?
There aren't really any reliable chemical means for inducing smoking cessation. You can.
Meanwhile, I didn't actually mention any chemical means, and it shows something interesting that in his head he has to go to chemical or supernatural. What about just will? I quit cold turkey.
Use a drug called bupropion. I think that's the one. Whatever Wellbutrin is.
Is that supernatural?
No, you don't need a supernatural effect, but it doesn't work very well. But if you give people.
So it's so strange. You can't quit smoking without a mystical experience, but you don't need a supernatural effect. You can use this drug, but the drug doesn't work very well. It's like we're not even speaking on the same subject.
Magic mushrooms, psilocybin, and they have a mystical experience. They have about an 85% chance of smoking cessation.
Sure.
With one treatment. But that's kind of like evidence, you know.
It's just
kind of like evidence.
It's evidence that you can take mushrooms and increase your chance of quitting smoking.
No, it's not. It's indication that if you take mushrooms and you have a mystical experience, you'll stop smoking because it doesn't work.
Okay, if you take mushrooms and you have an experience that you describe as mystical, then you'll increase your chance of smoking. But that doesn't tell me whether or not there was something to this notion that they had an experience that was supernatural in any sense.
It's not definitive evidence.
It's not evidence at all, not definitive evidence. It's not evidence at all. It is still the claim. It is the claim that you took mushrooms and you had a mystical experience, and that those two things combined give you an 80% chance of quitting smoking. So let's take a look and see if Dr. Peterson is any better in 2025 at saying and understanding things. This is from the Jubilee event with him and 20 atheists. My understanding is that there's clips here of his actual claims and content responses from others. I'm going to do this as if I got tagged in, so I'm going to be pausing frequently, but let's see how it starts.
My first claim, atheists reject God, but they don't understand what they're rejecting.
Atheists reject God, but they don't understand what they're objecting or what they're rejecting. All right, let me be clear on a couple things. First of all, if you don't understand something, you should not accept it. So saying that someone rejects something they don't understand is not in any way a statement of whether or not they were correct to reject it. And this sort of blanket statement for all atheists. Oh, atheists don't understand what they're rejecting. I'm sure there are plenty of atheists who may not understand what they're rejecting, and not understanding something is a good reason to reject the claim that it's true. It is not a good reason to accept the claim that it's false. But atheism, or non-theism, is the position of not accepting the claim some God exists. And so if the God that's being proposed is one that you can't understand, then you cannot reasonably accept it, which means you must reject the claim. The rejection, of course, is tentative. You're not saying it's false. You're saying, I am not convinced that this is true. But when he says that atheists reject a God they don't understand, not only is that what you should do for claims you don't understand, but I don't think that that's necessarily true. Within philosophical realms and within theological realms, there are a number of different descriptions of and categories of gods. There's the God of classical theism, the omnimax God, the all-powerful, all-knowing, morally perfect being. There are other gods that people have proposed, and as long as you get someone to describe what it is that they're advocating for when they say, here's what I mean by God, then you can say, I am either convinced of that or I am not convinced of that. And as long as if you're convinced, then you are a theist. And if you're not convinced, then you're an atheist. So right out of the gate, his first claim doesn't in any way suggest anything about there being a God or it being reasonable to believe in a God. It's just an ad hominem to suggest that atheists are just running around rejecting something they don't understand, as if rejecting something because you don't understand it isn't the right move. So he doesn't understand belief. He doesn't understand atheism. He doesn't understand the burden of proof, the nature of evidence, or the difference between rejecting something and asserting that something is false. But let's see how this goes.
My experience with atheists is twofold. Is that they have a very reductive notion of what constitutes God, let's say in the Judeo-Christian tradition, and they've often been hurt by someone who was religious or by the religious enterprise or perhaps by God himself, so to speak, and that's left them with an animus.
So here we're spinning this further. Atheists don't understand what they're rejecting, or they were hurt by somebody. And this is his experience with atheists, which means he's skipping over the entire event that he did with me and the event that he did with Sam Harris and others, because I wasn't hurt by anybody. I'm an atheist because I wanted to be the best Christian I could be, because I wanted to be a good defender of God to the people who needed to have access to the Holy Spirit to intervene. I'm an atheist because I was raised as a fundamentalist Christian, was taught certain things about God, and then came to find out those claims did not meet their burden of proof, have not established that belief in them is warranted. Now, for me, belief is the acceptance of a proposition, and you can also reject the proposition. You can reject the claim that it's true, but that's separate from also asserting that the claim is false. Some claims, like God claims, and this is my position, I'm not aware of any supernatural claim that is in fact testable. And if a claim is untestable, then as a skeptic, sound epistemology suggests you cannot be warranted in accepting it. So this is like a double-pronged ad hominem right off the bat. You atheists don't understand what you're rejecting, and mostly you guys got hurt by somebody. It is a complete dismissal of any intellectual pursuit that results in a reasoned objection to God claims.
We also have a short time here, so I want to get to the core of what you're arguing here, and I'd love if we could.
The core of what I'm arguing is that atheists reject God, but they don't understand what they're rejecting. So I'm trying to give you an example of what's being rejected and its complexity. Okay, so God rewards Moses with a glimpse of the divine.
Well, this is strange because he's saying we're rejecting complexity, and then he immediately goes to the biblical God is God. Because if you're going to say God does this for Moses, you are pulling from the biblical story, which means you are advocating for a specific Judeo-Christian and perhaps Muslim version of a God, the Abrahamic God.
So this is a definition of the God that atheists are hypothetically rejecting.
A possible one.
I said a,
Yeah.
I didn't say the.
Okay, here's the problem is that there are many definitions of God, but you didn't present it that way. You asserted that this is a God that atheists are rejecting and talking about what this God did. But there's no demonstration that that being exists or is a God or that the stories are true. So what we're rejecting in this case is a particular story of a God because it doesn't have sufficient evidence. And what his interlocutor is pointing out is that that's one of many things that it claims about God that we reject.
I said a.
That is possible, yes.
Okay. So despite the fact that Moses is a stellar character and he's had a long and difficult life and can withstand a lot of difficulty and travail.
Moses is a stellar character who had a difficult life. Well, I don't know Moses' character. I know what the Bible says about him. And I think that being raised by Pharaoh means maybe you didn't have quite the difficult life that Dr. Peterson might suggest, but go ahead.
God puts him between two cliffs so he can just see a crack of what's in front of him. And when God walks by, he allows him to see his back. Okay, so the implication of that story is that the divine is fundamentally unknowable. It's a pinnacle experience, and that people in their finitude have to be shielded from a comprehensive vision of the basis of reality.
So right here, he's going with, here's a story, and then saying the implications of it are that the divine is essentially unknowable or whatever, and that we can only see or touch a fraction of it. So first of all, that's not in any way a demonstration that atheists don't understand what they're rejecting. And also, if in fact this thing is too complex to understand, as I pointed out before, you are right to reject it. And what you're not right to do is accept that your understanding of it is real.
Well, that's not the God that's defined in that manner, right? It's not a simple personification. It's not a simple old man in the sky. It's something that, in its essence.
So, at this point, nobody has said we're atheists. We reject the simple notion of a man in the sky. But this is the straw man that he props up. Atheists don't understand what they're rejecting. They reject this simple man in the sky. They don't really, grok the complexity of the divine. At this point, considering he's sat down and had discussions with both myself and Sam Harris, as well as other atheists, I say this is disingenuous. I say that he's refusing to engage with the robust views of atheists who know and understand these things perhaps better than he does, and instead is constructing a straw man of atheists generally. They just disregard this character in the sky, which isn't a real character. And as somebody who was a fundamentalist Southern Baptist, intending to go to seminary to become a pastor, I'm well aware that the simplistic man in the sky isn't the God that I believed in when I was a Christian, isn't the God that Christians are generally advocating for, but it also isn't the same as all of the other gods that have been proposed, which atheists also reject.
This is unknowable and overwhelming. And that isn't, in my experience, the God that's defined by atheists who are attempting to undermine the story.
So here he is again. Atheists don't define God in order to undermine the story. For example, I've done a call-in show for the last 20 years. And the tagline, the popular tagline of that entire series of time is, tell me what you believe and why. I don't get to define what a true Christian is, and I don't get to define a God, and then when your God doesn't match up with it, say, oh, you don't believe in the real God, because there isn't a real God. I have no reason to think that there's any real God. So what do? We say, tell us what you believe in and why. And that way, a Christian can call in and defend the version of God that they believe in. A Muslim can call in and defend the version of God that they believe in. Same with a Jew. Scientologists can call in and advocate for what their beliefs are. We're not just rejecting, as a skeptic, God beliefs. As an atheist, I'm rejecting God beliefs. And anybody can call in and say, and they do, my version of God isn't the one you grew up with, Matt. It's not a version of Christianity. My God is everywhere. It's everything. We're all, literally had a call just the other day with them saying, we're all gods. Unlike the straw man version of atheists that Jordan would like to dismiss, those of us who are in the trenches doing this day after day are engaging with whatever God definition and description callers are coming up with. And those gods are either testable and falsifiable, or they're not. And if they're not, they should be rejected out of hand. But you don't just do that on this. You have to explain why. Because people who are calling in to defend God, generally speaking, do not understand what it is that we're actually rejecting and why. Just as Dr. Peterson doesn't understand what we're rejecting and why, which is why he's building a straw man right here in front of everybody.
I mean, it's the same claim, for example, that you're a finite creature and that you face something that in the final analysis is unknowable, and that you have to establish a relationship with it regardless of your inability to perceive or even withstand perceiving the whole.
So the notion that something is unknowable but you need to know it is already a really problematic position. I don't understand that. I don't understand people saying, oh, I don't have a definition of God, but I believe it's real. I don't know the characteristics or qualities of God, but I believe it's real. I believe this, but I don't know what it is. That to me doesn't make any sense. But when he talks about this in terms of, well, we'll continue here in a second. When he talks about this in terms of it's unknowable, but you have to have a relationship with the divine. No, you don't. I'm not convinced that there's anything divine. I'm not required to have a relationship with anything. And as long as something is nonsensical, unknowable, untestable, unfalsifiable, the only position I can hold on it is I am not and cannot be convinced that it's real. I certainly am not willing to say, ooh, I now have a relationship with this thing. And the problem that Dr. Peterson and many others have is that they seem to be completely unwilling to say, I don't know. So when somebody says to me, Matt, do you believe that a God exists? My answer is no, I do not believe that a God exists. And they would then say, so you believe there are no gods? That's not what I said. I said that I am unconvinced that any God exists. Well, you have to take a position. This God's been proposed. I don't have to take a position. My position is that God claim has not met its burden of proof. If it meets its burden of proof later, then it would have been irrational for me to say now that it's false. So I don't. Instead, I say it has not yet been demonstrated to be true, that belief is not yet warranted. I don't know that he understands what belief is or what warrant is. I don't recall those aspects of our discussion very well, but let's keep going.
My next claim is that morality and purpose cannot be found within science.
So what? Morality and purpose cannot be found within science. So this has nothing to do with atheism. It does have something to do with different moral guidelines. But what does he mean by purpose? I am not convinced that any externally imposed purpose for life or value for life is necessary or possible. Life is its own reward. My life has whatever purpose I ascribe to it. It's always funny to me that we live in a world where if the government dictated who you were going to marry and what job you were going to have, people would, by and large, revolt. We don't want to be told, no, this is your job. We want the freedom to guide our lives and fill the roles that are most appealing to us. As a matter of fact, if we're stuck in a miserable job that wasn't even forced on us, but was just a practical necessity, we're often frustrated and miserable. People hate going to work. So the notion that we should be looking for some God or external source to define what our purpose is already strange to me. Why is it that, it's like having your parents pick who you're going to marry or what your job is. And yes, there are cultures where that happens, but that doesn't mean it's a good thing and that the absence of that is a bad thing. Similarly, on the front of morality, while, for example, Sam Harris in The Moral Landscape describes a moral system very similar to mine that uses the findings of science to advocate for and evaluate certain moral positions, I don't think either of us have said or suggested that morality is found within science. Instead, for me, When I'm talking about morality, I'm talking about the well-being of thinking creatures, a phrase that Sam and I both use. Our views on it are slightly different, but there is no reason, no objective reason that needs to be the definition of morality. It's just the one that I'm using. But once we have that definition, the assessment of actions with respect to that goal become non-objective. Just like a game of chess, the rules are arbitrary, but the moves, the quality of the moves are not subjective. Your move either definitionally leads you closer to defeat or keeps you away from defeat or extends your distance to defeat. That's it. And those are objective assessments. So if what he's saying is that it is not within science to dictate that we should care about our well-being, correct. And so what? Because we still do care about our well-being. And there is no objection to a secular moral system that is resolved in any way by appealing to a God. So once again, he's misrepresented atheist in a straw man sense, and now he's arguing against something that isn't a function of atheism and isn't even close to the best and most robust positions on morality and purpose that are advocated by moral philosophers and by atheistic philosophers.
So your claim that morality and purpose can only be found in science is a little shaky, because I think that your claim is really being framed to be morality and purpose can only be found in religion. Is that how you're kind of framing it?
I would say that the domain of religion is the domain of morality and purpose, yes.
The domain of religion is the domain of reality and morality and purpose. I would agree that religions often make claims about morality and claims about purpose. The issue here is they don't agree on morality and they don't agree on purpose. And so you have a bunch of competing religions that are telling you different things about morality and different things about purpose, and none of them have demonstrated any way to identify which, if any of them, are correct. Some of them agree with my positions, but my positions aren't predicated on there being a God or anything like that. It is merely on, is this in the interest of our well-being? And there are certainly religious schools of thought that include moral values that are consistent with my own. And it's entirely possible that some religion out there has a moral position on some issue that is superior to one of my positions. But the way to become convinced that they're right is by them demonstrating that their view leads to an improved world with respect to well-being over my position. This is one of the strongest things about secular moral systems. Religious moral systems have no way to demonstrate that they're right. They're just basically saying, my God told me, or this is my God's character, or this is what I think God wants. Meanwhile, no God has spoken to anybody or verified any of this at all. And even if a God showed up right now and stood right in front of me and said, hi, Matt, I'm a God, and let me explain to you what the correct moral position is on this particular subject. If that God doesn't value human life and autonomy, doesn't value individual freedom, doesn't value those, if that God says, the purpose of your life is to worship and serve me, and morality is whatever I say it is, then I will say, I now believe that you exist. I have no interest in what your thoughts are on the subject because I'm already morally superior to you, given that you're advocating for A, B, and C, which we can show leads to a worse world. And the way some religions tend to get around that is to say, yes, but this world is like dirty rags. It's really about the afterlife. And so they tie the consequences of morality and the justification for morality to a being they can't identify. And they tie the purpose to an afterlife they can't demonstrate exists. And even if we had good reason to think there was an afterlife, and what you do here is going to determine what your disposition is in that afterlife, that does not in any way demonstrate that that is right or good. That is just fiat, divine fiat, declaration. This is what is consistent with God. So you're not defining what is good, you're defining what is consistent with your view of God, which you're free to do. And if you can demonstrate that it leads to a better world, I'll adopt that position, even if I don't worship your God.
Exactly. And also that science is actually structured, at least in part technically, to eliminate such considerations from its purview a priori.
So, to some extent, I agree with Dr. Peterson here in that science doesn't get to consider supernatural causation. As soon as supernatural causation is demonstrated to be real in a way that we can test and verify it, then it gets to be considered amongst candidate explanations. Until then, scientific process recognizes and does not say, ooh, there's nothing supernatural. It says, we have no way to verify and make use of anything supernatural if in fact it's real. Therefore, we don't get to consider those. When we're listing candidate explanations for the cause of this fire, we can say, is it a gasoline-based fire or some other liquid fuel? Is it an electrical fire? Is it lightning from the sky? Is it God just decided he wanted this house to burn down? There's no way to test for that, so science doesn't get to include it. Additionally, since morality and purpose are about value, and value is a personal perspective, how much do you care about this? A dollar bill has a certain value, different value to different people, and different values perhaps in different countries. And for somebody, it may not have any value at all. So once you get that subjective experience, this is why it's no longer within the purview of science. Science can't tell you what you should value, but science can do comparisons of how much you value something with how much others value something and come up with a statistical analysis about whether or not your value is comparable to theirs.
Okay.
Right? That's why we define science as value-free. But that has to be wrong because scientists have to prioritize their attention towards something before they can even engage in observation.
Scientists have to prioritize the retention before they can even... nothing about that sentence makes any sense to me. I would agree that science seems to be currently, and perhaps forever, but at least currently, prohibited from exploring the supernatural. But what Jordan seems to be implying here is that science needs, but ignores, morality and purpose. And I reject that. In the notion that when we're in a laboratory and we're trying to test a drug to see its efficacy, you would need to demonstrate that morality, purpose, or supernatural causation need to be considered before and that they could be considered before they should be considered. So I'm not quite sure what he's saying is missing.
Okay.
And that act of prioritization of attention is a value-predicated act.
So the act of prioritization is a value-predicated act is basically saying, because science values truth, it can't justify why it values truth, and that it does this, I guess, in the absence of valuing morality and purpose. This is completely unclear, but also irrelevant to atheism. If anything, he's pointing out what he thinks is a limitation of science that he thinks is bad. But the limitations of science are done because we go with what is testable and falsifiable, and what he's advocating isn't.
And so I can continue. There's all sorts of things we have to assume about science before it can take place.
So what I'm specifically pointing out here is about religion in particular, since you yourself are a Christian, right?
People debate about that.
Well, that's strange. Like I said early on, I don't get to define who is or isn't a true Christian. And so Dr. Peterson can have his own view of what is a true Christian, and he can determine whether or not he is one or isn't one. But I would say, with respect to the standard normative views of Christians, he's not. Because one of the things, both in a biblical sense and in a cultural sense, is that if you're a Christian, your answer to the question, are you a Christian, should be yes. I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Jesus Christ, for it is the power unto salvation. Go ye therefore into all the world proclaiming the gospel. If somebody says, are you a Christian? And you're like, well, that's been debated. That is a coy way of attempting to have your cake and eat it too. And so I would say that I would bet that most theologians would not consider Jordan Peterson to be a Christian, and that certainly most evangelical and fundamentalist Christians would or should reject him as a Christian based on this comment and others. But like I said, since I don't get to define who is or isn't a true Christian, maybe Jordan Peterson's a true Christian, and all the other Christians that I debate with for decades now on the shows, they just aren't, and he's found the truth. We'll see.
And I generally don't discuss it publicly.
Oh, I generally don't discuss it publicly. So you're hiding your light under a bushel, Jordan? I mean, you don't seem to have a good understanding of Moses. You don't seem to have a good understanding of what would be a reasoned demonstration of a God. You seem to be making very good use of the nebulous nature of religion to make it seem like you're saying something when so far, I'm not sure you've said anything substantive, at least in these clips, about what your view is or about what's actually wrong with an atheist view, other than a straw man and talking about morality and purpose aren't found in science. Congratulations. The cure to cancer isn't found in any holy book. But if that's not what it's there for, that's not a fault. It's a feature. It's a recognition of the limitations of science. But look at the joy on his face of dodging the question once again of whether or not he's a Christian. Because I think maybe he might be making some money off some Christians.
Yeah, I would say that the reason we evolved, so to speak, away from slavery was because the West was founded on Judeo-Christian morality and the presumption that every person was made in the image of God.
So he thinks we evolved out of, and I'm not going to dig in on the scientific definition of evolved. He thinks that society has moved away from slavery because of Judeo-Christian values. This is patently absurd. All you have to do is you go read Exodus 21. The Bible, which is the foundation of Judeo-Christian values, if in fact there is a God that serves as the ultimate foundation for the biblical view, that God has not corrected this biblical view, the Bible very clearly advocates for slavery. Exodus chapter 21 is one of the places that this happens, where it digs into who you can own, how you can own them, later on how much to pay for them, what the rules are for slaves. If God was actually, the Judeo-Christian God was actually opposed to slavery, then one of the 10 commandments, or maybe the 11th commandment, would be, thou shalt not own another human being as property. But in fact, the Bible says the opposite. It says you shall buy your slaves from the heathen that surround you. It says they shall be your property, or money, and that you can pass them on to your children. They are just property. You're supposed to treat them nice, but that means if you beat them, that's fine. But don't beat them to death. And so the way to tell is, if you beat them and they die within a couple days, then you've done something wrong. But if you beat them and they don't die within a couple days, then you were fine. To pretend that the Bible, which has many, many problematic passages about equality and about humanity and the dignity of humanity, about the difference between the value of men and women, its different takes on LGBTQ issues, not that it has any real understanding of those, but to suggest that it is Judeo-Christianity that should be credited with an end to slavery is patently absurd. The reality is that while Christians played an important role in eliminating slavery in the West, they didn't do it based on Christianity. They did it based on cherry picking versus and ideas that Jordan is advocating for, while ignoring the other ones. Love thy neighbor, turn the other cheek, those things. The people applied those to slavery, even though the book is generally specific that there's a difference between brethren in Christ and how they are supposed to be treated, and people outside of that. I've come not to these other people, but also that in the Jewish sense, there was a separate set of laws in the Bible, right there in Exodus 21, for Hebrew slaves that was different from your Gentile slaves. If you buy Exodus 21 verse 2, if you buy a Hebrew servant, 6 years shall he serve, and in the 7th he shall go free, unless you trick him into staying your slave forever, which it tells you exactly how to do in the verses that follow that. So this is a fiction that's either coming from someone who does not know what the Bible says, does not know the history of it, and instead opts to go with, hey, there were Christians who were instrumental in eliminating slavery. And you know what? You're absolutely right, because there are Christians who do good things, and there are Christians who are better than their holy book or their religion. That's not a surprise. It's how some of them find their way out.
Wouldn't you
And so
say
slavery itself became immoral, and
Yeah.
that was established by Protestant Christians in the
Yes.
UK, who then convinced the
Yes.
UK government for 200 years to go to war on
And
slavery.
wouldn't you say that this is about the cultural evolution of humans in general rather than just
No,
Christianity?
I think it's the
'Cause-
flowering of the ideas that were embedded in the biblical texts across long.
The flowering of the ideas in the biblical text. The Bible specifically tells you that you shall buy your slaves from the heathen that surround you. That's not a text that can flower. That's an instruction. It's not ambiguous. When you go to the text that Jordan would like to think flowered, what he's actually talking about are humanistic principles that are not consistent with the biblical view, and saying, we've grown and learn more about the human condition than those ancient Israelites knew. And so now we have a better understanding. He makes the mistake, I think, of saying it became immoral when he should say it became more prominently viewed as immoral. My position is it was always immoral. It's just that the people then didn't recognize it. But that's not even completely true either, because I'm pretty sure that if you wanted to find out whether or not slavery was moral, you could have asked a slave. And generally speaking, the slave probably could have taught the slave master an incredibly valuable lesson about morality. But when the foundation of it is that we are unequal, that I am in one category of person and you are at another, when that is the justification for slavery, when, as Voltaire said, if you can get people to believe absurdities, they will commit atrocities, the foundations of biblical views of categories, and not only that, it exists outside in caste systems in other religions as well, the us versus them mentality that is fundamental to the Bible. Men are different and prioritized over women, including what property they can own. Jews are God's chosen people, and they are prioritized above Gentiles, which is why there's a separate set of rules for slaves that are Jewish versus slaves that are not Jewish. Jordan doesn't understand the Bible or human nature, and he would like to play into this narrative that the good ideas of the Bible flowered and grew. But to the extent that there are good ideas in the Bible, and I say that there are, their flowering and growing came from being watered by humanism and by people who did not agree on the fundamental things that were listed in the Bible with regard to human value.
Spans of time. My next claim is that everybody worships something, including atheists, even though they might not know it.
Okay, so what? How is that a point? So first of all, it very much depends on what you mean by worship. In the most charitable sense, if you mean everybody reveres something, I would hope so. I'm sure there's somebody out there who doesn't really revere anything. But I revere the truth, human dignity, science, skepticism, humanism. These are things that I revere. But I don't worship them in the sense that I think of worship. And my view of worship may be different from others because I was raised as a Southern Baptist fundamentalist Christian. And worship to me, worshiping God, was not merely reverence for an idea. It was being subject to an agent that was the authority. If God tells you to do something, the worshipful thing is to obey. This is why it is foundational within Christianity that there is a turning away from sin, that God is an authority that cannot be questioned, and if you don't understand something and God told you, you should do it anyway, which is already a problem. But if you want to say everybody worships something, okay, so what? I think the things that I worship in that loosest sense are things that theists often worship as well. So for example, if you want to say, Matt, you worship intellect. I don't think I do. I don't revere intellect, but I respect it. And at that level, don't you? Nope, I only worship God. So you don't care about truth? Well, God is truth. Well, you don't care about goodness? Well, God is goodness. Oh, okay. So you're taking these things that you have reverence for and you're packaging them up and putting them in one little package so that you can say, that's what I worship. Okay. So it's your ideology. Let's assume for a second that even the worst case scenario of what he's saying was true and that everybody worships. Like on Sundays, I treat the show, the Collins show, as if it's my church service. I go there and I worship skepticism and critical thinking. And I worship reasoned arguments and evidence. And I worship human dignity and autonomy. What's wrong with any of that? I don't worship a God. I don't worship a magical being. I don't worship an agent that exists outside of space-time, whatever that means. I don't worship a holy book. I don't worship Jesus. I don't worship Allah. I don't worship any of those things. And so what you're suggesting is that there's something wrong with me showing reverence for ideas that other people also show reverence for. They just want to give it a different label. What I'm saying is that truth and goodness don't need or deserve or require having the God label, because you're taking good things and adding something to it that is not demonstrably real or good. So this claim that everybody worships something even though they may not know it, so what?
I want to start off with like defining terms. How do you define worship?
Prioritize.
Prioritize. Okay. So I gave him the kind of charitable view of just respect or reverence, and he's saying prioritize. I've listed the things that I have reverence for. We can just call that prioritize. Yes, I agree. Almost everybody, because I'm not going to speak in absolutes like that, but I would say almost everyone prioritizes something. Again, so what? This is, I don't know how many claims he makes. I think this is number 3. I don't know how many claims are in this Jubilee video, but this was a claim that you needed to bring to atheists. I mean, maybe you should be bringing this to worshipists, the people who are running around saying they don't worship anything, and then say, oh, but you prioritize something, because even those people would say, well, of course I prioritize things. Everybody, oh, well, that's what I mean. Everybody prioritizes something. Well, cool. Water's wet. We need oxygen. What's next?
So almost like having a preference over something rather than the other.
It's a hierarchy of preferences,
Yeah.
and you use it to direct your attention.
Right.
So whatever you're attending to, you're worshiping.
Right. So
Whatever you're attending to, you're worshiping. So right now, I am attending to Jordan Peterson's comments in this video, which means, according to what he just said, I am currently worshiping Jordan Peterson's comments in this video. But I'm attending to it specifically to determine what portions of it I agree with and reject. And so that just means I'm focused on it and evaluating it. But that's a temporary thing, because when this video is done, I'm not going to sit around and assess this same thing again from him. I don't need to do another video on this after it's over. Now, there may be another video about other things he says in here. As a matter of fact, I'm almost sure there is, because somebody sent me a clip that we decided to do separately. But okay, once again, my answer is, so what?
I've kind of become a little bit familiar with your idea of like this value-laden hierarchy,
Yeah.
right? And you kind of posit that at the bottom of this hierarchy, or you call it top or bottom, I
Yeah,
suppose. At the bottom of this hierarchy, this foundational priority in your life is going to be considered God.
That's
is that
right.
correct?
Yes.
Right. I'm trying to imagine a situation in which could there be that someone has a priority at their foundation that is different from someone else's?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, probably better to think about it as multiple values, but that there's a hierarchy of values with something at the bottom.
Okay, so first of all, I don't know who this woman is, but I like her. She's doing great. but she's asking questions and she at least has an understanding of him. I don't know what the nature of this event is, how much they were prepared or what they were allowed to focus on or not allowed to focus on or talk about or whatever else. But she's doing a good job of saying, hey, if I understand you correctly, okay, you're saying that worship is the thing that you're focused on, the thing that you're attending to, the thing you prioritize, and there's a hierarchy, and whatever the baseline thing is, that is God. And so she basically said, would it be possible for people to have different gods? And he's like, yes. And so now we're here with, it seems that what Peterson's saying is everybody has a God, a baseline foundational principle or idea that is the thing that they always attend to. And on that front, not only do I not necessarily think that's true, it is at most true in the sense that what you have as your baseline foundation can shift and can be situational. Like, I'm going to prioritize my family over somebody else's family if I have to make a choice between those two. But when I don't have to make a choice between those two, I'm going to prioritize both families. And this is fundamental. So I think what he's probably getting to is that those of us who are going to prioritize ourselves at a baseline basically worship ourselves and think of ourselves as God. But that is God in an abstract sense. Nothing about what I'm prioritizing in this reality is fundamentally different now that I'm an atheist than it was when I was a Christian, except that none of the exclusively theological propositions from Christianity remain in any sense of priority for me. I still, you list off the commandments. There are some of them that I still think are good ideas, but all of them are written poorly and sloppily. I still value not murdering people. But I don't need Christianity for that. I need empathy and an understanding of the consequences of actions and what produces a better world and what doesn't. So I like the fact that she's building towards something. I don't know if we're going to see enough in this clip to get there, but what he's basically acknowledging is, when I say everybody worships something, I mean you're all focused on something, and the thing you're most focused on or most baseline focused on, that's God to you. But once you say that's God to you, you're not talking about what God is, you're talking about what your perception of God is. And your perception doesn't necessarily match reality. And reality is the thing that I don't think Jordan has a particularly good grasp on, as we saw back in the mystical experience smoking thing.
Right, but at the bottom is God, and
That's a definition, yeah.
Yeah, so at the bottom is God, and there can be multiple people with different conceptions of God, and they're each valid in being called God. So there are multiple gods that exist.
It depends on what you mean by valid. So far.
Okay, so valid was the wrong word to use. No slight to her. She probably understands philosophy better than he does because he doesn't understand it at all, as we're getting ready to find out in this other video I'm doing later. But validity applies to the structure of an argument. Soundness applies to its truth or the truth of premises. And so I think he might be trying to pick a nit here, but he's very, very frequently doing that. Well, it depends on what you mean by this. It depends on what you mean by this. It depends on what, yes, I know it depends on what I mean by this, because if by validity I mean peanut butter, then clearly we're probably not going to mean the same thing. But what I can't understand is why he doesn't just say, I mean this. Him saying what he means is often like pulling teeth to get out.
So good, but it depends on what you mean by valid, because I would say that some foundational conceptions don't play out when they're implemented. So if you put the wrong thing at the foundation, you end up in hell, for example.
So not everybody's God concept that they put at the foundation is correct. So he's swapped out valid for what she intended, I think, which is correct. She was basically saying if everybody's foundational thing is God, then that means there's many different gods that exist. And he's like, ooh, I don't want to acknowledge the logical consequence of the statement that I made that she just exposed. Instead, I will say that if you put the wrong thing there, it's going to be a problem. Yeah, we knew that too. If you're focused on getting wealthy at the expense of everybody around you, that's going to turn out bad. I mean, these are basic principles of just game theory and cooperation and risk analysis that have nothing to do with whether or not there is in fact a God as an extant thinking agent, a creator, a force. None of what he says is consistent with either philosophical and theological discussions about deities or Judeo-Christian, even though that's an invented term that doesn't exist, mindsets, which is what he keeps coming back to. He wants to talk about Moses and credit Judeo-Christian this and everything else. And now he's basically saying that, yeah, it's possible for you to have the wrong foundation. Cool. How do you tell which one's the right foundation?
That's what happens in totalitarian states.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you're saying
So they're not all equal. Like all foundational principles are not equal, even though they might be equally foundational. Right.
So what makes one kind of foundational tenet like better than another one?
That's an excellent question.
Yes, it is. And that is not an excellent answer. I'm almost willing to bet that he is not going to give any sort of declarative about how to determine what the right foundation is.
Iterability. Imagine that you play a game with someone and you're a kid, and it's fun. So then you play again and again and again.
So repetition.
It's playability across multiple iterations. So then you have a friend, and a friend is better than having a game, right? So that's one. Breadth of application is another. So if it's just for me now, it's not as good as something that would be benefit to both of us across time.
I'm seeking to know.
Well, he was slightly less vague than I expected him to be, but I'm not clear that he said anything about how to tell if it's right. A broader definition that can be useful in multiple iterations is better than one that is only useful to one person in one situation. But considering that we're here talking to a bunch of atheists, and these are people who don't accept a God proposition, and Peterson is there as someone who is suggesting that there's something wrong with atheists and that they reject a God they can't understand and yet they still worship something. They just worship like the wrong things. You would think there would be some demonstration of what he thinks should be at the foundation. For example, if I were to put back on my fundamentalist Christian hat, I happen to have one handy. If I were to put this back on and think like a Southern Baptist, the correct foundation, according to Christianity, is God. God is the morally perfect being that serves as not only the creator and sustainer of reality, but the foundation of goodness. It's not divine command theory, although there are those that advocate for it. It is that which is consistent with the character of God. Then the atheist me gets to say, cool, thank you for that. How do we determine what is or isn't consistent with the character of God? Because I have yet to have anyone explain to me what God thinks in a way where I can actually be confident that they are correctly representing God. As a matter of fact, from a biblical standpoint, let God be true and every man a liar. So until some God gives me 5 minutes of his time, they deserve none of mine. And I shouldn't be spending time on it if it weren't for the fact that there are people all over the place who say and think that they know what God wants and want to ensure that they can then impose that on the rest of us. Jordan, instead of thinking perhaps that he knows what God wants or what the right answer is, he's just really cool about saying all the rest of you got it wrong without ever telling us what the right answer is.
Whether I worship something. You've claimed I worship something, and I want to know.
If you want to have a deep and meaningful life, then you have to go all the way to the bottom.
He's already pretty frustrated right here. He's saying you have to worship something. Okay, so there's something foundational, and if you want to have a deep and meaningful life, you have to go all the way to the bottom. So first of all, what is a deep and meaningful life? And why should I want one? Because what Jordan means by deep and meaningful life may not be something that any of us desire, and there's been no demonstration that we should desire it. I think I have a good life. I think that I have the purpose that I've attributed. I experience love and joy and happiness, and I seek knowledge, and I try to make the world a better place. To me, that is deep and meaningful. I almost titled this video, The Duke of Deepity. A deepity is a term that was coined by Dan Dennett's daughter, actually, where any statement is a deity if, to the extent that it is true, it is trivial, and to the extent that it is profound, it is false. They are statements that feel or seem to be profound and true, but they are not both profound and true in the same way. And so when you say everybody worships anything, that sounds profound until you realize, no, all you mean is that you pay attention to some things and you pay attention to some things more than another. That's not profound, that's obvious. And to the extent that it is true, I mean, it's trivial, but to the extent that it is profound, it is in fact false. Where the profundity of this statement that everybody worships something is this notion that, oh, you all have a God. It's an equivocation fallacy, because the God that I used to have when I was a Southern Baptist, the God that many Christians have, the God that many Muslims have, is not just something you attend to or something you focus to. And it's not even just the foundational thing from which your focus is derived. It is the core object that is prioritized over everything, including your existence, because this life is like dirty rags. He's irritated this guy for something. I don't know where this edit came from, but let's see.
Or the top, and insofar as you're capable of doing that, because otherwise you'll be fragmented and miserable and anxiety-ridden and hopeless.
Fragmented, anxiety-ridden, and hopeless. So after Jordan and I did our discussion in I think it was Montreal, it wasn't long after that he went away for an experimental medical treatment that left him in a coma in order to free him from an addiction. And I know that he's a trained mental health kind of, well, I don't want to say mental health expert, psychologist, psychiatrist, it doesn't matter. He's making assertions that without this sort of worship, you will be fragmented and anxious. Okay, that's a cool assertion. Back it up and show how what atheists are doing, what I, as a secular humanist who does not believe in any God, who is advocating for human rights, individual autonomy, and for the policies and procedures that demonstrably lead to a life that is more beneficial than harmful, demonstrate how that makes me anxious and fragmented and what the solution is to it. Because you seem very irritated right here while making claims about other people's psychological makeup as if you have the answer. So what is it?
So I have to worship something to have a meaningful life. And
There's no difference between those two things.
There's no difference between worshiping something and having a meaningful life. There's no difference. So in order to have a meaningful life, you must attend to things, but you can attend to the wrong things, and you can have the wrong things attended to as the foundation. And that might make you miserable, but it would still be meaningful. Everything about what he's saying contradicts something else about what he's saying, because he has no cogent thought, no clarity or understanding about this.
Okay.
They're the same thing.
So if I don't worship anything, my life will not be meaningful, correct?
Well, that's the definition of nihilism.
Okay.
Okay. First of all, that's not necessarily the definition of nihilism, but even if it were the definition of nihilism, that's not an answer to the question. He's tossing out phrases and buzzwords as if they're supposed to do all the heavy lifting for him, because he's incapable of doing the mental heavy lifting on this.
So if I'm a nihilist, I don't worship anything.
That's true. And then you...
Oh, okay. You just said everybody worships something. I think you just agreed there is a class of people that doesn't.
Exactly. See, finally we've got someone, and this may have happened elsewhere, I realize I'm looking at an edited cut, but finally we've got someone who is pointing out the very contradictions in what he's saying. That essentially you've defined something this way, and you've defined it this way, and those two things are in conflict. You can't say, basically, Jordan's saying nobody's really a nihilist. So it's a no true Scotsman fallacy.
Well, they're incoherent in their worship.
Ah. So you're incoherent in your worship. No, sir. You are incoherent in your definitions, and you are incoherent in your rational thoughts. This individual just pointed out a conflict, and now you are doing a post hoc rationalization to say, well, they're nihilists, but they actually do worship something, even though the definition of being a nihilist, which it's not, is not worshiping anything. And so that makes them incoherent in their worship. Okay, that's like the people who say everything is this or this, except for the exceptions, but let's ignore the exceptions. Sorry, you don't get to do that. This is why maybe, Jordan, you should stop speaking in absolutes and declarations, especially when you're treading into realms of philosophical arguments and rational justification where you are weakest.
And hand gestures like that aren't going to help. My final claim is that
hand gestures like that aren't going to help. I don't know what the hand gesture was, but okay.
Atheists accept Christian morality, but deny the religion's foundational stories.
Cool. Atheists accept Christian morality, but deny the foundational stories. First of all, that is entirely possible and not problematic. You could make a list of every moral position that you say is Christian, because there is no a Christian morality. There is no the Christian morality. There are a variety of Christian views on morality, which is why you've got the Baptist churches that hate the homosexuals, and then you've got the gay churches. They're both pointing to the same Bible. I think one of them is more closely tied to the biblical roots and one isn't. But when you say atheists accept Christian morality but deny its foundational stories, it is entirely possible. If you tell me murder is wrong, thus spake Zarathustra, I accept that murder is wrong, and I reject the foundations of that, the Zoroastrian foundations of it. I reject the Judeo-Christian foundations of it. Instead, I accept that morality is wrong because my view of morality is predicated on the well-being of thinking creatures, and that if you kill me, that is against both what I desire generally, and it is in conflict with my welfare, and thus should be viewed as immoral from that perspective. So I don't, though, accept Christian morality, nor is it the first, nor is it foundational. But there are plenty of things about that Christians say are moral or immoral, which I wholeheartedly reject. I disagree with Christians about LGBTQIA issues. I disagree with Christians about whether or not men and women are equal. I disagree with Christians and Jews about whether or not slavery is immoral, whether or not slavery was ever moral. I disagree with them on a number of different moral positions, but I agree on some. And the reality is, we agree on the things that are demonstrable and warrant justified acceptance. What do I mean by that? Well, I know that eating a ham sandwich is immoral to somebody. It's a violation of what God wants. I have no moral problem with eating a ham sandwich because the particular foundation that they want to cite for that is one that I don't accept. It is only immoral because God commands it to be so. My position on murder is different because it is not merely immoral because a God says so. It is immoral because it is in conflict with what is demonstrably best for human beings to thrive and survive. Matter of fact, it's in direct conflict with their survival. So to say that we accept Christian morality but deny its foundational stories, this is the fourth claim. And the first one was that atheists reject a God they don't understand, which is actually a good thing. You're supposed to not accept things that you don't understand. Now we've moved on to atheists are secretly accepting Christian morality while denying its foundational stories. You've not demonstrated that there's any problem with that, but you also will see if you're able to demonstrate that we do. Because my parents are Christians. We do not agree on many issues when it comes to morality. I was a Southern Baptist Christian studying to be a preacher. I know the Bible and I know Christianity better than the overwhelming majority of people who have ever sat in a pew in a Christian church for anything more than a day. I don't know the most. I'm not an expert, but I still know more than almost anybody who's ever sat in a pew, because this has been my life study. And originally it was going to be my life study because I was going to be here as a minister, as a tool of the risen Christ, to allow the Holy Spirit to work through me to lead people to Jesus. Not my will, but thy will. I'm just a conduit. I had moral views that were entirely consistent with the Bible and would have been viewed as Christian moral views that I wholeheartedly reject now. And it is only ignorance and cherry picking that would allow someone to think that the rest of us out here are just borrowing from Christian morality. I don't need to borrow a moral view that isn't demonstrably true and does not have an identifiable foundation that I can actually point to. The foundation of Christian morality is somebody says this is what morality is and then points it to their God that they can't demonstrate. Instead, I'm telling you what my moral foundation is, pointing to it, and moving forward from there. And the well-being of humans is a real thing. There are things that are demonstrably in our best interest and conflicting with our best interest. Let's see what they say.
So God says that you can own people as property. He says that you can beat them with a rod too. He commands genocide in Deuteronomy, in Numbers, and in Samuel. I mean, they have a goddamn...
Okay. I like what he's doing, but I don't like the... I'm probably missing part of the conversation here. And this is partially because of the way Jordan's talking about it and how he keeps talking about this Judeo-Christianity. When this individual, this atheist, I'm assuming in front of Jordan, starts saying, God says this and God does this, we need to make sure that we're all clear. We have no reason, we don't believe there's a God, and we don't believe that God has said or done anything. We don't believe that we have access to anything that God has said or done. What we're saying is the claim from the believers is that God said this and God does this and God advocates this. So I don't want to nitpick this person because listening charitably it's this, but just in case that becomes an issue, somebody out there, I know because I've done this for 20 some odd years, somebody out there is going to say, see, he just admitted that God said something. If you can't be an atheist and say God said something, sorry, but we need to just get the context in just a little bit. But yes, so he's saying that the God of the Bible advocates for things that he rejects, just as I was saying. So good for that.
Baby barbecue in Numbers. Like, is all of this in line with Christian ethics?
No.
No. So this is interesting. This person just pointed out things in the Bible that are immoral. And Jordan seems to agree. I won't push it too far yet because we're going to hear what else he says. That these things are not representation of Christian ethics. And looking, I've seen this face before from him, but let's see what he says.
So then God doesn't fit within Christian ethics?
Well, the biblical library is a continuing story, and everything written in it has to be contextualized by the entire text.
Okay. So there are things in the Bible that are portrayed as morally acceptable, but are not morally acceptable. And the problem is that when we atheists object, we're taking it out of context. Okay, maybe Jordan is a Christian because this is exactly the same nonsense that Christians who don't understand their own Bible and religion try to do all the time. You're taking it out of context. You're taking it out of context. On this very channel, I have a video about slavery that reads and goes through the verses one by one, talks about the context. By the way, he's not a historian and he doesn't know the biblical context in either case. So when he says the rest of us are taking it out of context, that's ridiculous. The only right answer is that the Bible is wrong when it says it was ever permissible to own people as property. That is the only rational conclusion. Otherwise, you are then saying what is moral changes based on the time and the events surrounding it. Now, I'm an advocate of situational ethics, that there are things that would be acceptable in one set of circumstances and not in another. I have no idea what circumstance he's going to come up with that shows why it was okay to own people and beat them. I'm not aware of any. I can't even imagine any. I won't say there aren't any, because people have come up with really strange scenarios where they're like, well, if the choice is between the bad guy shooting your friend or your friend agreeing to become the bad guy's slave, it's more moral for him to become a slave. Yes, that's a fundamentally different issue. That is nothing at all like what the Bible says and advocates for. That you can own people as property, that you should buy them from the heathen that surround you. Because at that point, if there's somebody on the block as a slave, and you have money to buy that person as a slave, the most moral thing you could do would be to buy that person and free them. He and others want to act as if, oh, there's no choice. These were prisoners of war, or it was indentured servitude. First of all, indentured servitude itself is immoral, and it's contingent on the morality of the legal system that you're under as to whether or not you have any legal recourse. But we've learned a lot about prisoners of war as well. And you know what we don't do anymore? We don't do what the Bible says, which is to go out and kill all of the men and all of the women who've known men, but keep the virgin girls for yourself. The people who are advocating for this book and these religions that are based on it cannot acknowledge that the book is wrong, because the follow-up question is, how do you tell which parts of the book are right and which parts of the book are wrong? And they're not going to have an answer for that is anything more than my personal opinion or guidance of the Holy Spirit, which they can't demonstrate is true to anybody else. And so here we are, we're taking it out of context.
There's 65,000 hyperlinks in the biblical text.
There are no hyperlinks in the biblical text. I have no idea what he's talking about. 65,000 hyperlinks in the biblical text.
And you can take pieces of it out of context and criticize them, and that's what you're doing. But
no, sir, you're a liar. Because some of us have gone through, and not only from a past of accepting and understanding the context, but have gone through it including the context. The fact that this guy is paraphrasing a problem while under a time clock does not mean that he is taking it out of context. Please, Dr. Peterson, give us the context under which slavery is morally permissible.
that's a mistake, I think. It's an analytic mistake because you're putting the cart before the horse.
The way you feel.
Oh, I'm going to bet that he doesn't explain the context, because I guarantee you he does not know the context. We've already sat down and sorted this out. Between myself and Jordan, I'm the one that knows the Bible better. And I'm the one that has been a committed public Christian, advocating for those things, and later rejected it. He is making use of it as a convenience in order to grift, I suspect, believers and non-believers alike. But I can't demonstrate that. It's just a suspicion. It's also possible that it's not true, because so much of what he says is completely incoherent babble.
About Horus or Taoism or something is how I feel about Christian morals, I think.
Yeah, but how do I feel about them?
Well, that you took inspiration from them, you learned from them. Maybe
That's a good start,
right.
You know, because I would say that actually constitutes belief. You know, like you said, well, look.
Right.
In Noah, in the story of Noah, right? Noah is inspired by the apprehension that all hell is going to break loose. So
Noah is inspired by the apprehension that all hell is going to break loose. I don't know that that is an accurate description of that, because the Bible in Genesis 6 begins talking about this, but God was going to destroy everything, but Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. Noah wasn't inspired. God comes down and says to Noah, "Come thou and all thy house into the ark, for thee have I seen righteous before me in this generation." This isn't inspiration. This is direction. Now, if you want to say the story is not literal, and so God is not directing Noah, but is instead inspiring Noah, he inspired him to take an impossible quantity and assortment of animals onto a thing, and then didn't actually do a global flood, etc. But this is what happens when Dr. Peterson starts talking about the Bible. First of all, try and get him to explain whether he thinks the story is literally true, metaphorically true. To what degree is it true? And since he views all of this as humanity's flailing attempts at understanding reality, all of it seems to be inspiration. Ask him if he thinks God directly communicated with Noah with instructions.
Yeah.
He regards that inspiration as God.
Okay.
Right? And when God comes to Abraham, he comes to Abraham as the spirit of adventure. It's inspiration. One of the definitions of God in the Old Testament, unsurprisingly, given the derivation of the word, is inspiration. And so if you take inspiration from Christian ideas, then insofar as you do that, you are in fact a believer, which was my point with regards to atheists
Correct.
not understanding
But have
what
you
they're
taken
rejecting.
inspiration from Taoism or from studying Egyptian mythology?
Definitely.
So
This is absolutely more flailing avoidance of the issue. Oh, I've been inspired by this, just like Noah was inspired, just like Abraham was inspired. Was Abraham's wife inspired? This is so bizarre. This is someone who knows enough to view the Bible as a storybook that people take inspiration from, and yet doesn't know enough to actually distinguish the difference between here's a story that can be inspiring and that is therefore God. I'm waiting for the phrase metaphorical substrate to show up, but
then you believe them under that definition?
Yeah, but I've incorporated them into something I think that's more comprehensive.
Is it possible to take inspiration and to appreciate the teachings without being a believer in their truth claims?
It depends. No, I don't think so, but I think.
So it's not possible to take inspiration and not believe in their truth claims. So now he's at the point where he's denying that the book can be inspirational and not true as well. But I think his definition of truth might be fuzzy, where he doesn't mean it's literally true. He's fine with a metaphorical truth. But I don't know, because he doesn't answer anything. I don't know why anybody pays attention to him. It's very difficult when he's saying so little and then getting the attention of being the dude who needs to face 20 atheists when he couldn't even do well against one.
See, there are different kinds of truth claims, right? There's propositional truth claims, which are the truth claims of what you say. And then there's embodied truth claims, which is the truth claims of what you do.
No. Truth applies to propositions. Propositional claims are what he is saying are also what he describes as embodied truths. That is a proposition, which is either true or not. Truth is what you do. No. If I lie, does that make it truth? I have embodied intentional deception. Does that make it truth? This is what I mean. I had no idea he was going to say this, but yeah, The guy doesn't even understand what truth is and cannot speak with any clarity at all on the subjects.
It should be prioritized. Optimally, what you say and what you do would be brought into harmony. But I would say if you had to prioritize, it should be what you attend to and what you act first.
What you say and what you do should be brought into harmony. So propositions exist for anything. Propositions are how we determine what reality is. It is, the start is, I propose this as an explanation for this observation. I propose that this is accurate. I propose that this is accurate. Logic is propositions. Propositional logic. Yes, I know that propositional logic isn't the only one, but this is everything should boil down to this. And so the proposition is some God exists. And then you define your terms. We'll skip some for now, but for God, for Peterson, it seems to be some ultimate point of focus exists. The thing is it possible for the thing that you're it is true, it may be true that you have an ultimate point of focus, but the object of that focus may not exist, in which case your object of focus is really just a fictional invention in your head. So for example, if, let's say there's Jesus and Allah. If only one of those two is in fact a real divine being, and I'm focused on the other one, then the focus that I have, it is true that I have a focus and I'm using this thing as my focus, but that thing is not real. Just like I could worship Lord Voldemort. I could worship Hannibal Lecter. Your God is Hannibal Lecter. Well, cool, thanks, but Hannibal Lecter isn't real. Oh, yes, he is, because you have a Hannibal Lecter concept and it is your focus. Please explain to me how this is different from what he's actually saying.
And that's what Christ actually says in the Gospels, because he points to the Pharisees, for example, who say all the right things, but don't do any of the right things, and points out very clearly that that's not acceptable.
I fully agree.
That was actually the end, I guess, of the supercut for this. So yeah, we ran over an hour on this one. I was surprised, but yes, the full version of the full video of my debate with him, I'm pretty sure is up on this channel. If not, you can Google Jordan Peterson, Matt Dillahunty, and find out there what that is. And whoops, I have, there we go. There's probably going to be additional video coverage of this, both from me and I'm sure plenty of others. But it's weird to me that instead of putting atheists up against a theist, someone who is advocating for a theistic proposition, they instead didn't pick a theist or a deist, but they picked someone who wants to talk about the potential value of having these conceptual things that are kind of like theism and kind of like deism, while smiling and being sly about, oh, it's been debated about whether I'm a Christian or not. Let me tell you, when I was a Southern Baptist, I would have looked at him and said, only God knows, but he's not like any Christian that I recognize. And that's still fairly true, except that I have no reason to think there is a God who knows, even if Peterson might. In the years that I've been debating these topics, since finding my way out of Christianity, there have been public debates with people who are incredibly frustrating and people who are not. I don't remember being especially frustrated at Peterson because he's like Jell-O. It's really hard to pin him down on anything. It reminds me of when Bill Clinton was being impeached and he wanted, well, that depends on what is. Really? Trust me, I'm a fan of definitions and pedantic clarity when it's necessary. But this is far closer to sophistry than anything substantive. And I can't imagine that the people who were there felt like either their atheism or any version of atheism was adequately challenged or even honestly addressed by Peterson. And I would find it hard-pressed to find a theist out there who thinks that their version of theism, and certainly their version of Christianity or Judaism or Islam, was in any way defended by Jordan. So even if I'm not a fan of this format, and I'm not, and even if I'm not a fan of Peterson, and I'm not, I don't know what anybody got out of this other than a guy came in and made claims that were unchallenging, didn't defend them, didn't explain why these claims should be problematic to anyone, and then made assertions that weren't backed up, and a lot of statements that were not cogent. There was nothing about this where it was clear, oh, here's what he means. Here's what he believes. I still, to this day, have no idea what he believes. But because of a clip somebody showed me, I think that's probably the next thing we're going to talk about in another video. But this one was nice and long. Thank you so much for your attention. Yeah, that's the quick summary on my take of Jordan Peterson versus 20 Atheists.